All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So I'm gonna get straight to it. This one right here, this is for the dinosaurs. This is a throwback. This story right here took place back in November of 1987. For all those of you old timers that have been doing time since the 80s or were doing time, in the early 90s, I'm talking about the C numbers, the D numbers, the E numbers, not all these double BB, CC, CA numbers. I'm talking about them old school numbers, the dinosaurs. This one's for you guys. Some of you might even remember this incident because it was one of the more notable incidents that took place on one of the transportation buses, or you might even know somebody that was involved. But anyways, during this time when this incident took place, the war was on between the Mexican Mafia, the Nuestra Familia, the Black Guerrilla Family, and the Aryan Brotherhood. All four of these groups were involved in a full-fledged conflict that spanned across the entire state system. In fact, the late 80s, early 90s, that was probably around the time when the war was probably at its worst, because you had all four of these groups that were involved in the conflict, and each one of these groups had its own following. You had the Norteños, the Sureños, then you had, for the Black Guerrilla Family, you had the Bloods, the Crips, you had the Bay Area Blacks. For the Woods, you had the Sacramaniacs, you had the Nazi Lowriders, countless other subsidiary groups across the board. So prison was definitely a different environment back in those days. The Nuestra Familia and the Black Guerrilla Family had an alliance, and the Mexican Mafia and the Aryan Brotherhood had an alliance. And when I say this conflict spanned across the entire state system, what I mean is this. Back in those days, you had prisons like Jamestown, Solano, Susanville. You had prisons like that where Norteños and Sureños were out there programming together. However, occasionally things would kick off on those yards. A war would kick off. Something would kick those yards off. But then you had other yards like Folsom, DVI, San Quentin. You had those yards. Tehachapi was another one that were considered war zones. The war was on. As soon as you hit the yard, it was go time. Those yards were considered war zones. They weren't programming together. As soon as they got off lockdown, as soon as they got back out there on the yard, they were doing their thing. So prison was definitely a different kind of environment back in those days. And everybody was involved in that conflict. It was a full-fledged war. All four of these groups were involved in this conflict. There wasn't nobody that wasn't involved. And these incidents were sporadic, scattered across, the state. Different prisons were kicking off at different times, but the war was on. There was no agreement to end hostilities. There was none of that. The politics were being pushed back in those days. Everybody was slammed down in the SHU programs, and it was just a different environment. At this time, 1987, I remember around 1987, Tehachapi Max was probably the worst prison to be in those years. Corcoran and Pelican Bay weren't even factors in those years. I think Corcoran opened up in 1988, and then Pelican Bay opened up a year later in 1989. But Tehachapi was the worst prison to do your time at in those days. You had Tehachapi Max. That was the SHU program. I had homies that I remember that were paroling from Tehachapi Max, and it was a war zone. Some of the stories, some of the things that I heard about that were going on over there at that time was crazy. But this is what was happening back in the late 80s, early 90s. One of the things that were a lot different back in those years that you rarely hear about taking place today during this time right now is the tier warfare that was taking place back in those days, and the type of hits that were being orchestrated. Back in those days, you had matches, you had sulfur, so people were making zip guns, people were getting speared, blow darted. You had other people that were prolific at slipping their cuffs, and everybody had handcuff keys back in those days. Either they were making them, manufacturing them, or they were getting them smuggled into prison. But the dynamics of the war were different back in those years. The things that were being orchestrated back in those days, you don't see that happening today. For the guys that were doing SHU time, when you're locked up in the SHU, you don't really get too much action at hitting somebody, because you're locked in a cell 23 hours a day. You're locked in there, you're caged up, so you don't really get to see that much action. But for the guys that were doing shoot time, they were more prone to getting theirs whenever they were off the tiers, when there was any off tier movement, when they were being escorted, or when a door would pop open, or if they knew how to slip their cuffs. And you had a lot of individuals that were willing to go on these kamikaze type missions back in those days. One of the other ways that guys would get theirs in is during transfers, whenever they would catch a bus from one institution to another. Those times right there's a lot of movement. You're in and out your cuffs, you're in R&R, they're putting you in cages, you're getting moved around a lot. So during that process, there's times when the cuffs come off, or when somebody doesn't lock a cage. There's all kind of different mistakes, things that can happen. But that's when, these guys they were more prone to something happening, is obviously when they come out of their cells and they're in movement, they're in transit. And for guys that were doing shoot time, it's just prison politics. Whenever you were out off a tier, you were under escort or something like that, and you had an opportunity to take flight on the opposition, it was mandatory for you to get yours in. If you didn't, it was considered an act of cowardice. So there was always guys that were either trying to slip the cuffs, or they were trying to make their way into a cage with somebody else, or try to get one of the COs to make a mistake so that they could get theirs in. That's the kind of shit that was happening back in these days. You don't hear about too many incidents kicking off on the transportation buses nowadays. You hear about, an incident that will kick off here and there occasionally. But back in those days, getting transferred from one prison to another, the Mexican Mafia, the Nuestra Familia, the Aryan Brotherhood, even the Black Guerrilla Family, when they would be on these buses and they would be getting transferred to different institutions, a lot of shit used to happen back in those days. Guys used to get their throats cut. We used to call them Kool-Aid smiles. They used to get Kool-Aid smiles. Or, something would kick off on the bus. Somebody would slip their cuffs. There was a lot of different incidents that took place over the years that happened on the buses. You knew when it was time for you to transfer, you knew that when you were on that bus, you had to keep your head on a swivel. You made sure you knew who was sitting behind you. You made a mental note of everybody that was on that bus with you, where they were sitting, any kind of threats. You made mental notes in your head. This is where this individual is sitting. This guy, this is where he's sitting. And you did that because you knew that back in those days, somebody was always trying to get one in on the buses. And you're in close proximity to other people. You guys are cramped in, and you're more vulnerable, you're more susceptible to something happening. Somebody that's sitting right behind you, they get up to use the bathroom or something, and they got a razor in their hand. It's as simple as that, and it's a done deal. The story that I'm about to tell you guys about right now, it took place on one of the transportation buses back in 1987. Like I said, to be more specific, back in November of 1987. And this bus right here, it wasn't a routine bus. This was a special transport. This bus right here was moving a lot of the high profile guys that were in Folsom and San Quentin. They were moving them to Tehachapi Max, to the SHU program. So this was a special transport bus, and the individuals that they had on this bus, they had a lot of high profile, or what they were calling back in these days, high powered individuals that were on this bus. Now, the thing that makes this incident right here unique is that it involved 7 individuals from different groups. You had a Sureño, 2 Aryan Brotherhood members, you had a Nazi lowrider, a Texas Syndicate member, a Black Guerrilla Family member, and a Nuestra Familia member. You had all 7 of these individuals going at each other. 4 of them had weapons, and it kicked off on the bus, and it was a good one. Again, this incident took place during the time when CDC were shuffling a lot of individuals around from Folsom, San Quentin, Tehachapi. They were putting a lot of the individuals that they felt were part of leadership in Tehachapi Max. And this was one of the many buses that would be transporting, that would be making these runs to Tehachapi. And the funny thing about it is a lot of the transportation officers that were involved in transferring a lot of these guys back in those days, they did little or nothing about this conflict, knowing that they were putting mortal enemies on the same bus together. Even though they had anticipated something was going to happen, they were still putting these guys on the bus together, out with everybody else in the bus, not locked up in the cages. They were putting them right there in the bus with everybody else, letting them do their thing. Almost like they were daring them to fight, because you guys know that, for those of you that have done time, you know that transportation officers, those guys are cut from a different cloth. It almost seems like they try to find the meanest, ugliest, baddest COs to be transportation officers. They're all assholes. I'm sorry if there's any transportation officers watching right now. Maybe this is just something you guys do to discourage, cats from acting up or being disrespectful on the bus or fighting. But all the transportation officers that I ever ran across, it doesn't matter how respectful you try to be towards them, they're all assholes. And they love threatening to lose your property. If you motherfuckers don't know how to shut up, you don't know how to whisper to the guy next to you, your property's not going to make it to the next institution. Your property will be lost. They tell you that all the time, and they're dead serious about it. And if they didn't lose your property, they would just wait until they got you to the next institution, until they got to the destination, and then they take you somewhere to a cell somewhere, and they beat your ass. And then they bring you back, give you lunch, and put you back in with everybody else. So again, sometime in November of 1987, there was a bus that it went through Folsom, and from Folsom it went to San Quentin. It picked up everybody that it was going to pick up. And again, these were high profile type of individuals. Some of them were leaders, Aryan Brotherhood members, high profile Sureños, Nuestra Familia members, Black Guerrilla Family members. You had some Bloods, some Crips, and some other individuals. But for the most part, there were some high profile individuals that were on this bus. It's not a routine transfer. This is, one of those transfers where they're like, you know what? Fire up one of the buses. Let's get these individuals on this bus and let's get them over here to Tehachapi. Let's get them up out of here, because either they're causing problems, something's going to happen, there's some kind of concern or something. But it's a transfer that's out of routine. So in prison, good news has a way of getting around. Inmates have a way of finding out things that are going to happen before they happen, whether it's information that's passed through a CO or through some other kind of inconspicuous way of getting that information. They find out, when they started bringing Sureños to San Quentin, before they actually got there from Southern California, everybody in San Quentin knew about it. The COs were telling everybody, hey, they're going to start busing in Sureños. Everybody over there knew about it before they even got there. And, they use that to their advantage. And that's what always happens. When inmates find out, when they get a jump on some information that could somehow benefit them, they exploit it. Whether it's somebody that's going to hit their yard, some kind of change that might affect them, some kind of imminent, something that's lingering or something, they find out about it and they'll exploit it and they'll use it to their advantage, as they're supposed to. And that's exactly what happened here. A lot of the individuals that were doing time back in those days started hearing rumors about these special transfers that were taking place. And the transportation officers were purposely putting mortal enemies on these buses together. And they were practically daring these guys to go at it with each other. Word started getting around in Folsom and San Quentin that they had these random buses that they were putting together, and they were putting, known enemies on these buses together. And a lot of shit started happening. People were getting stabbed. Some people were getting packed out. Guys were slipping their cuffs. And, for those that didn't know how to slip their cuffs and couldn't defend themselves, they were getting the dog shit beat out of them, or they were getting stabbed up, poked up pretty good. So, these stories were prevalent back in these days. When these guys started hearing about it, they started planning. They started putting together contingency plans in the event, they ended up on one of these buses. They wanted to make sure that they had some type of game plan, some type of plan, and that they didn't just get caught off guard, just get put on a bus unexpectedly, and now you're in this position, you don't know how to react. So one of the things that really became crucial back in those days are handcuff keys. Everybody was learning how to make them, or they were getting smuggled in. Matter of fact, a lot of the klesha back in those days, I remember a lot of the klesha revolved around how to make handcuff keys, how to make them out of a piece of plastic or out of something indurated, something that was solid enough to be able to put into a handcuff key and not break it. There's like a little tooth and a little pattern that you gotta follow in order for it to work. And you can't use a flimsy piece of plastic. You got to use something that's hard enough to be able to put in that lock and turn it and actually turn that mechanism. Anyway, one of the other things that we used to study back in those days were the locking mechanism on handcuffs, how to compromise that lock. And it was as simple as having just like a comb with one tooth, just so that you could stick it in and push that little slide, that little release back, and it would open up just like that. There's some exceptions. I believe when they double lock them, you can't do it. But even if a cuff is double locked, if you slap it up against the wall hard enough, a certain way, you can unlock it. These were things that were a lot of these guys were being educated on back in those days. How to slip the cuffs, how to slip your chains. A lot of guys used to inflate themselves when they were putting on their belly chains. They fill themselves up with air to make themselves seem like they were bigger. And the officer that would put the belly chains on would put them on, and he wouldn't want to put them on too tight. So he put them on, and then this guy would just let all his air out, and he'd have just enough slack to, step through them. So, I mean, there was a lot of things like that. One of the things you really had to be careful for back in those days are, guys that were coming out of their handcuffs. There was a lot of individuals that were prolific at doing it, and it was something that, you had to be concerned about. You do not want to get caught with your handcuffs on or with belly chains on, and somebody else is able to come out of theirs and they have a weapon. Bad situation to be in. So obviously back in these days, one of the requirements for getting transferred to another prison was to have a weapon. It was mandatory to take a weapon with you and a handcuff key. So if you were in a situation where you needed to come out of those cuffs and you had to do it, fast, then you could. So back in those days, a lot of guys that were just waiting to get transferred out, they were waiting to catch a bus to another prison, they would keep a weapon on them. And a lot of them during that time before that bus got there, a lot of them would always try to manufacture some type of handcuff key or something so that they could compromise the cuffs. So back in those days, when it was time for you to transfer out, you knew that you were going to be put on a bus, in a couple of weeks or, a couple of months. You had a weapon on hand at all times. And a lot of guys that were waiting to catch that bus would try to manufacture a key. At least try. You got to try to make one so that when it was go time, you had one if you had to come out of those cuffs. Enemies that had been hated for years were now being placed together, and the only thing that separated them were belly chains and shackles. But at some point, when these conflicts started to get out of control and CDC wanted to curtail these conflicts to some extent, they stopped giving advance notice to guys that were getting transferred out. Before they used to tell you, hey, in 2 weeks, you're going to be on a bus to Folsom, or in three weeks or a month, next month, you're going to be catching a bus to wherever, Solano. They stopped doing that. Not only because somebody could orchestrate an escape or, have somebody waiting for a bus, have some kind of assistance outside, the prison, but also so that these guys wouldn't be prepared, wouldn't have, weapons, or wouldn't have handcuff keys in anticipation for their transfer. Normally when you're going to transfer, they'll come up to your gate and they'll tell you such and such, roll your stuff up. You're on a bus. I'll be back to get you in around 20 minutes. Pack up all your property and be ready. I'll be back. and they'll leave. They'll go off and they'll handle whatever they're, whatever else they need to handle. And then they'll come back 20, 30 minutes later and you're there, you have everything packed up, you're ready to go. But they didn't do that when they told Wino that he was transferring. They told him he was transferring and they posted up right there in front of his gate. They just stood there hounding him, watching his every move. Whether or not they did this to see whether or not he was going to have a weapon or, just to make sure. And I'm sure that the reason why they did this is to make sure that he didn't have any opportunity to keister a weapon, or, if he had any kind of contraband in that cell, he didn't have an opportunity to secure it. They were going to stand right there on his gate watching him as he packed all his shit up, as he rolled up his bedding, and then as he backed up and cuffed up to the door. But Wino was one of those individuals that was just a little bit smarter than the average guy. When he realized that this was the game that they wanted to play, that they were going to stand there and they were going to hound him to make sure that he couldn't grab his knife, or that he couldn't grab his bundle of paperwork or his handcuff key. When you're in the cell, no matter whether they're standing there watching you or not, if you're pretty slick about your business, the hands are faster than the eye. And that's what Wino did. So he started packing up his shit and he grabbed his key and he did what he had to do. And then he sat on the toilet like he was going to take a shit. He just sat there and was like, hey, man, I got to use the bathroom. You know what I'm saying? I can't help it. I got to use the bathroom. What am I supposed to do? I'm going to be sitting on the bus for the next 4 or 5 hours. I got to use the bathroom. So, when he sat there on the toilet, at some point, unless they just want to be looked at like they were just kind of funny style, that caused them to back up just a little bit, just enough to where, he could keister that handcuff key. And that's what he did. He sat there on the toilet and he keistered it. Once that was secured and, he's ready to go, he bounced up, grabbed his shit and backed up to the gate, cuffed him up, and they took him out of the cell. So from that point on, after they pull him out of the cell, they escort him down the tier, put him in the cage downstairs. From that point on, the process was routine, just like, any other transfer or any other time that he left the tier. So they take him and they eventually escort him to R&R. He gets to R&R, they put him in a cage, they process his property, they do all the shit that they need to do before they transfer you out. And, now it's just a matter of waiting until they actually put you on the bus. And, this is a time this is what separates convicts from inmates, a time like this right here, especially if you're somebody that's deeply involved in politics, if you're somebody that's involved in that conflict, if you were somebody that was involved in that conflict, this is a time that's crucial. You're there in R&R and you're getting ready to catch a bus. You know what the possibilities are. You hear about these buses that are being put together, and they're putting known enemies together on these buses, and shit's kicking off. So Wino goes into that, that active mode. Instead of, being like the rest of the inmates that are talking loud, they're not paying attention to shit. They're talking about, what it's like over there in Tehachapi. Wino's standing there and he's making mental notes of everything that's going on. Who's there in R&R with them? He's making mental notes of all these inmates that are slowly trickling in one by one. So Wino's there, he's in the cage and he's posted up and he's watching all these guys that are slowly trickling in one by one. And he's making mental notes of these individuals. This guy, Crip. This guy, he's a blood. This guy, he's a Bisa. Is this guy a friend or a foe? These are things that you have to do. If you're paying attention to your surroundings and you want to know, who's around you, you're going to pay attention to things like this. You're going to pay attention to the details. You're going to be looking for tattoos. You're going to be looking for different characteristics that might identify somebody. So, he's standing there and he's taking all this in. He's looking for allies. He's looking for enemies. And these are things you have to be conscious of. It is imperative that you are, because, could depend on whether or not you become a victim or, you allow somebody to get the drop on you. You were in R&R, you weren't paying attention, you were bullshitting with everybody else while, these individuals were coming in and you completely missed them. These other guys that are talking about how much they want a cigarette and, how good it's going to be to drink a shot of Folgers off the canteen. These guys are oblivious to their surroundings, and that's why they're easy targets. And once everybody's there, then I'm sure he tallied up in his mind, okay, this is how many allies I got, this is how many possible enemies. These are just mental notes, things that you do, and they become second nature over time. It's just it's something I can't explain. It's just part of doing time. These are the things that are going to determine whether or not you survive in prison, is by how well you pay attention to your surroundings and who's around you. So once everybody was there in R&R, there ended up being a total of 4 sureños, including Wino. There were a couple of Crips, some Bloods. You had a couple of white guys that didn't really look like they were, that they really were into politics. And then he had a couple of individuals who he considered to be allies. In fact, some of these guys were in the same block as him. They came from one block with him, so he knew who they were. So aside from the Crips, the Bloods, and some of the other individuals that were there with them in these other cages, there was no Norteños, there were no NF members, there was nobody else there that he identified as being a possible or potential, enemy. So at that point, Wino identified 3 allies. He had 3 potential allies that were transferring with him. One was an AB member named Chris Backing. The second one was another AB member named Big Tex. And then there was an NLR member named Pee Wee. So once they got to the point where they line you up next to the bus, and then eventually they bring you up on the bus one by one, and they put the shackles on you. When they were lined up by the bus, there was one individual that they identified as a BGF member named Abdul. They started plotting against Abdul before they even got on the bus. That was the only potential enemy that they identified. So according to Wino, Pee Wee, Big Tex, Chris, and himself all had handcuff keys. All 4 of them had handcuff keys, so they were ready to slip their cuffs and take their shackles off when they needed to. So the plan is that, when they got on the bus, Chris and Pee Wee were going to make their way to the back of the bus, and were going to drop their weapons. In other words, when you have a knife keister, they were going to take their knives out of their asses. So, the plan is for those 2 to head to the back of the bus so that they could get back there, take their weapons out, and, then everybody was going to start taking their shackles off and start slipping their waist chains. And then at one point, they were going to hit Abdul. But that plan changed. While they were still outside of the bus, plotting on Abdul, they look over towards 4 building and they see a door open up and 2 individuals were being escorted out. One of them was an NF member by the name of Flaco from San Jose, and the other one was a Texas Syndicate member by the name of Richard Cisneros. And, one of the things you guys need to keep in mind is back in the late 80s, early 90s, the NF and the Texas Syndicate actually had a strong alliance at one point. Later on, that alliance would fall apart and they would go through a small war. But at this time, a lot of the Tejanos were riding with the NF. They were strong sympathizers. So at one point in time, they were considered to be strong allies. So when they seen Richard and Flaco come out of 4 building, this was more reason for concern. Now these guys were going to be on a bus together. They weren't going to be in cages, and they were going to have an opportunity to, do something to each other. So as soon as these guys seen that Richard and Flaco were coming out of 4 building, they all knew that something was going to kick off on that bus. It was imminent. It was definitely going to happen. It was just a matter of when and who was going to kick it off. The other thing that Wino said that him, Pee Wee, Chris, and Big Tex knew was that Flaco and Richard definitely had weapons on them. It was a mandatory requirement for most of these guys to carry weapons, and it was something that was known amongst each other. So at one point, Richard and Flacco end up, they walk him up to the bus, and now everybody's lined up on the bus. And this is when they start putting the shackles on these guys. They start shackling them up one by one. And as they shackle them, they direct them up on the bus. So the first three to get shackled were Crips. You had three Crips that got shackled up, and they got up on the bus. The next one to get on the bus after the three Crips was Wino. And Wino knew that, time was of the essence. He had to get on that bus, head straight to the back, and try to drop his shackles and his waist chains as soon as he could. Because now, there was the potential of, these other guys dropping their cuffs or getting out of their shackles before them. So time was definitely of the essence. He had to get his key out and come up out of his waist chains and his shackles as soon as he could, because now the dynamics changed. Now there was some potential enemies that were about to board the bus, and it came down to, or it could have come down to, who were the first ones to get their chains off. Whoever got their chains off first, the others were going to become the victims or potential victims. But he knew he had to head straight to the back of the bus and get that key out. The next one to get on the bus was Chris, followed by Tex, and then Pee-wee. When those three got on the bus, Chris and Pee-wee also headed to the back so that they could drop their knives. So you had all three of these guys in the back of the bus trying to pull keys and knives out of their asses all at the same time. I'm trying not to be graphic, but this is an important part of this story. So while all this is happening, Abdul, Flacco, and Richard, they all board the bus next. And right when they get up towards the front of the bus, like right towards the first couple of seats, they hit the floor and they start trying to come up out of their chains. The transportation officers, they're still outside the bus. They're still putting shackles on guys that are waiting to get on the bus. So these guys are on the floor. Now you got a total of 6 guys that are fumbling to get either keys or knives out of their asses. There's 6 of them. The only one that, isn't trying to pull something out or drop something is Big Tex. But you got all these other guys that are trying to pull keys out, trying to drop knives. And, Wino told me that at one point, while all this was going on, you could see, Richard, Flacco, and Abdul trying to pull their weapons out, and everybody was doing it openly. You might as well. Everybody knew that it was happening. The whole bus started to smell like shit. That's a telltale sign that either somebody's dropping a piece or, somebody's pulling out some paperwork or something like that. When you smell shit, somebody's dropping a piece. And it was already obvious. You got all these guys that were openly trying to do it, trying to drop their weapons. But Wino said, the whole bus smelled like shit. There was a strong stench of shit in the air. And eventually, these knives started coming out. Richard and Flacco were the first ones to get their weapons out. Even though these guys had a head start on them, they were the first ones to get theirs out. So they get their weapons out. Obviously, they must have had keys or they slipped their chains. But, from that point on, all hell broke loose. Wino said that as soon as he dropped his shackles, that Richard and Flacco, they sprung into action. Richard went at Chris and he hit him in the shoulder and he just went in on him. So you got Richard going in on Chris and Flacco went in on Tex and he started stabbing the shit out of him. According to Wino, he said, man, Flacco, he did something vicious. Like that dude, he started stabbing the shit out of Tex. Tex, almost like he froze up when Flacco got on him. But, he hit him in the face, he hit him in the head, hit him in the neck, and he was on his shit. He was stabbing the shit out of him. So, these guys are going in on each other. Meanwhile, Pee-wee takes off on Abdul. Pee-wee starts stabbing Abdul. I'm not sure what Abdul's, I'm not sure if Abdul had a weapon or not. I believe he was also trying to drop a piece I'm not sure if he had it out or if he ever even used it, but Pee Wee went in on Abdul, and you got these three guys stabbing each other. At this point, the whole bus smells like shit, and you got three guys that they're stabbing somebody on the bus. In the meantime, in between time, Wino didn't have a piece, but he had his chains, and when you have those chains and those heavy locks and you're swinging them around, those are good weapons as well. They're just as good as a knife. They can inflict some damage. So Wino started swinging his chains. He went in on Richard. I believe he said he went at Flacco a couple of times, and these guys were all getting off. It had turned into just a big melee. Beep, bop, beep, beep, bop, bop, beep, bop. But they're not throwing blows. They're not throwing hands. They're stabbing each other. And when all this started, the rest of the inmates that were on the bus, a lot of them jumped up and were just trying to get the fuck out of Dodge. They were trying to get out the way. So, it was chaotic. You got bodies flying around everywhere. You got guys running after other guys trying to stab them. And, the COs, the transportation officers, they're trying to get on the bus so that they can try to take control of the situation. But a lot of the guys that were trying to get out the way so that they wouldn't get stabbed or they wouldn't become potential victims, they were all pushing up against the front gate. So the transportation officers couldn't get in. Eventually, they must have pushed their way through or told them guys to back up, because they ended up coming through. And, Wino said that he's standing there and he's swinging his chains, and he, at one point he was hitting Richard in the head, and all of a sudden he started getting hit with a barrage of rubber bullets. They started firing off the Bertha. So Wino said that, at some point he's there, he's got his chains and he's swinging his chains. He's hitting just anybody and everybody. He said at one point he even hit Pee Wee on an accident, but, he's not paying attention to what's going on up at the front of the bus. But apparently, like I said, the COs must have either pushed their way through or told those guys to get out the way, because they got on the bus. He hears the transportation officers shooting rubber bullets, and they were shooting in rapid succession. He just heard one after the other. They were getting pelted with rubber bullets. Everybody back there was getting hit. And he said they didn't stop until everybody was down. He said, the only good thing about the guns when they came on and they started shooting the rubber bullets is that, the sulfur from the bullets, the smoke from the canisters that they were firing, that right there overpowered the smell of shit that was in the air. He said that bus smelled like shit, man. There was shit everywhere. People running around with shitty drawers. He said that was the only thing that made the bus smell better. I can imagine. I got visions seeing cats running around with, shitty drawers, but their concern isn't, whether or not they got shit on the back of their pants. Their concern is trying to pull that piece out so that they don't become victims. But anyway, so the eventually everybody prones out. They get on the bus. The transportation officers get on the bus, and they start manhandling everybody that was involved. They take them off the bus, slinging them around like rag dolls, and they lay them out on the ground, on the concrete. You guys got to remember, this is like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. It's early, it's cold as fuck outside, and they're laying these guys out on the concrete. But they know it. These transportation officers, they know the ground's cold, and they want them to lay there and suffer. So that's what they did. They lay them down, and Wino said it was so cold, he was freezing. It got to the point to where he felt like he didn't know what was worse, getting hit with the bullets or laying on that cold concrete, because it got to the point where he felt like his body was getting ready to go into shock. That's how cold it was. He was like, bro, I wanted to tap out. It was cold as fuck out there. But, they were taking their sweet ass time processing the bus like it was a big crime scene. And, eventually they would get him up. But I guess when, the shit kicked off on the bus and one of the gun towers outside became aware of it, they sounded one of the alarms. And, when that happened, They have COs that were responding from all the different buildings. So, this shit kicked off on the bus. Now you got 1,000 COs outside the bus. They all want to put hands on somebody. Then they drag them out. 1,000 COs out there with their gloves on, popping their gloves, taking their handcuff keys and clicking them. And they all, they all can't wait to get on the bus and pull somebody off, drag them out and lay them in the cold. And that's what they did. So according to Wino, Tex got it pretty bad. He was stabbed up pretty bad. Flacco went ham on him and just said he butchered him. Abdul got it pretty bad. And then, there was a couple other cats that weren't involved in that melee, but they either got hit with rubber bullets or somehow they got hurt, but they ended up taking 5 people off on gurneys. Everybody else got medically cleared and they all got put back on the bus and would eventually get transferred to Tehachapi later that day. Even Pee-wee I guess he had a laceration or something on his forehead, and that was the result of Wino slinging around his chains. But, they even medically cleared him and allowed him to catch that bus to Tehachapi. So Wino, Richard, Flacco, and Pee-wee, they were all placed in, the cages up in the front. Now, they weren't going to let them ride in the back, not after that incident. They put them all in the security cages. That's usually right. They never used to let me ride in the back of the bus with everybody else because I was a SHU inmate. Every time I caught one of those buses, they always put me in one of those cages up in the front, like I was Hannibal Lecter or something. Anybody that had a SHU program, that's where they would put them. But apparently that's where they put these for. And like I said, then they were transferred to Tehachapi later that day. Anyways, this was just one of many incidents that took place back, around 1987 when this war was in full effect. This was just one of the many crazy incidents that took place on the buses back in those days. But this was one of the most notable that was talked about for years after, especially by the Texas Syndicate and the NF, as they had hit 2 of the AB's top members. You had a Texas Syndicate member, a BGF member, and an NF member against 2 ABs, a Nazi lowrider, and a Sureño, all involved in the same incident. And 4 of them had knives. That was a pretty big incident back in those days because, occasionally something would happen on the bus. Maybe somebody would jump up with the razor and slice somebody, or somebody would slip their chains and come out with a piece and stab somebody. But rarely were there incidents like this where you had 4 guys with knives from different groups that were stabbing people, that had handcuff keys. You had 4 of them that had knives. You had multiple people that got stabbed and, a situation that just ended up turning this chaotic. A lot of the other incidents just involved, 1 or 2 individuals, or 2-on-1 or a 3-on-2 or something like that. But this was one of the bigger incidents. Tex ended up checking in a few years later after this incident. Pee-wee would later become an AB member, only to end up locking it up himself. And then Chris backing would eventually also lock it up. So ironically, the politics that got these 3 individuals involved in this one incident would also be the same politics that would take them out the game. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this story. We got some other stories that we're working on. In closing, for those of you that keep asking about the application link in order to become a potential winner of the scholarship, the link is posted in the community section on my channel. All you guys got to do is go to the community, look at the posting that I posted like a week ago. At the end of that message, the link is posted right there. But those of you that have been asking about that link in the comments, I've been putting it in your comments as well. So you guys just look. That link is posted in multiple places on the channel. I'll continue to put it in the comments under some of you that are asking for it. So if you see somebody's comment that's asking where's the link, go in there and look and see if I responded to them. Anyways, it's late. You guys be safe. This your boy B, and I'm out.